G'day guys, welcome back to the channel, and today of course we are here to preview round 10. A lot of big matchups coming up in this round, and we're really starting to see teams really split up between the teams who can be contenders this year and the teams who seem to not be really up there when the whips will be cracking at the end of the season. So the first game are two teams that are going to be right up there, we think, at the season's end, which are the Gold Coast up against Hawthorn Thursday night in Darwin. A very interesting game. Both teams coming off a 5-day break. Gold Coast coming off a very good win, even though they nearly slipped up in the end, and Hawthorn coming off a win that was pretty hard fought. Now, the Suns have seemed to have returned to form after a very poor performance against the Brisbane Lions, and the really 3 weeks over that period, they really weren't performing that well. And like I said, they nearly got caught up by the Bulldogs, but for the first 3 quarters, they really seemed to be the better side. So it wasn't really much of a surprise to see the Suns win that game. And up in Darwin, they have such a great record. I don't actually think they've ever lost up there. So going up against Hawthorn this week will be very interesting. Now, Hawthorn did pretty well in the final term to break away from Melbourne. However, all things considered, they really struggled to find momentum through the majority of the game. So it's going to be a very interesting contest up in Darwin, this one. But both teams are coming off a 5-day break, which I think definitely helps out the Gold Coast Suns. So me and my brother are both going to be picking the Suns in this one. A 5-day break. The Suns are staying up there in the NT. They seem to be a lot more simulated to the conditions. Being their second game in a row up there, I think they'll be able to play the conditions quite well. And Hawthorn playing the majority of their games in Melbourne so far this year, I don't think they'll be able to assimilate to the conditions of the NT very well. I wouldn't be surprised if they actually rest a few players for this game. I think Gold Coast win this one pretty comfortably in the end. I do remember last year Geelong went up there and had a pretty poor performance, so I wouldn't be too surprised if Hawthorn do the same. Bulldogs did pretty well to stay close with them, but I don't really think that's going to be able to be done by the Hawks over the week. And plus, the Hawks over the last few weeks really haven't been that good. I mean, they've beaten a couple of teams lesser than them. Obviously, Richmond in a couple of weeks ago, and they did beat Melbourne, but it wasn't really convincing. So I will be very surprised if Hawthorn go up there and win. Next game I want to take a look at, Saturday afternoon. This is a massive game between two teams contending this year, Collingwood and Adelaide. So both teams coming off very good wins. Of course, massive game at the MCG with these two teams playing some of the best football. And in most recent times, these two teams have played some massive contests. A lot of these games are under a goal, no matter where it is being played. Now, Collingwood should get a lot of their players back after a 5-day break and playing Fremantle. A lot of them were rested, players like Pendlebury, Maynard, and the like. So I'd be expecting a lot of them to be coming back this week. There are a few injury concerns with the likes of Dacos and that, but I think they will be fine. Only player that will be out at this stage is Lachie Schultz. There is a lot of talk about potentially them dropping the game against Fremantle, but they were really mature in their performance. So I'm expecting that this is going to be a hard-fought contest from the Crows. And the only way I think the Crows can win this game is if they win the midfield battle, which is going to be tough. Now, I think James Peatling probably takes the job on Nick Dacos. One of the big reasons they got smashed in the midfield battle in the showdown was the fact that they let Butters get off the chain. Rosie coming off a halfback was brilliant as well. So I think that James Peatling is probably the only one who can really tag. I think he will go to Nick Dacos, try and shut him down. I'd be surprised if the Crows make the midfield battle go head-to-head, if I'm being honest. But all things considered, I think Collingwood will win this one. Being at the MCG, the Crows got smashed in the midfield last week. I think they almost have to win it convincingly to have a chance. And I think Collingwood's defence really stands up against the Crows' forward line. Now, the Crows' forward line has been one of the best in the competition so far this year, so there would be a chance there, but Collingwood's defence just seems almost unbeatable at times this year. I think they'll be able to stand up to it pretty well. And to be honest, I think this could be a pretty convincing win for the Pies. I just don't know about the Crows in this game. I think that they will be coming off a very hard game in a showdown. A lot of the SA teams coming off a showdown don't have their best performance the next week. So up against pretty much the benchmark of the competition right now in Collingwood, I think they may struggle. However, these games have always been very close. We've seen that in the most recent games. Last year, the Crows got a little bit of a dubious decision late, which cost them in the end. And who knows? This could be a very close game, but I think that Collingwood is just going to be a far superior team. Now, my brother is picking the Pies as well. He has said the resting players last week, they should be have too much firepower up forward. And he also thinks that the Pies defence actually lines up quite nicely with Adelaide Crows, which I previously mentioned. Next up, we have Saturday night contest between the Bulldogs and the Bombers. What a game this will be. Both teams going into it with pretty good form. The Dogs coming off a pretty tough loss against the Gold Coast, but like I said, it was up in the NT. It was always going to be tough for them. And the Bombers coming off a great win against Sydney. Now, both teams coming off a pretty good past month or so, but the Dons have been playing against some lesser opposition, with the Swans probably being their toughest win of the last 3 or 4 weeks. So this is probably their first real big test. Midfielders likely will go head-to-head, I would say. Both teams, even if they both even out, I think the game will be won between the respective forward lines. Probably the weakest line of either side, and whichever team can find better avenues to goal will win this game. Now, Essendon's defence last week against the Swans was absolutely pivotal in beating Sydney. Now, granted, Sydney's forward line is pretty much makeshift at this point, but they stood up really well against the Swans forward line. Anything they threw at them in that final term, they stood up to a lot of it. So that is going to be a really interesting matchup, and I will be very interested to see what the Dons do with Norton and Akamas. Norton does need to stand up very soon, because I think if they're going to be able to make a real stand in finals, Sam Darcy can't just be the man when he does return. Norton needs to be a lot more pivotal up there for them. And Akamas has been doing pretty well so far, so I do give him that. On to the tips. Me and my brother both be tipping the Dogs. I think they've been one of the best teams in the comp so far this year. Even at the start of the season when they had a lot of players out, they were still absolutely brilliant, the Dogs. So I'm going to be picking them on the fact that they are just going to be, I think they're the better team on paper, better team so far this season. That's the real reason why I'm going with them. And I think Bontempelli, the first few weeks that he has returned, he has been insanely good. And I think with a pretty limited preseason, I think he's just going to get better and better as the season goes on. So Bontempelli, I think, just matches up too good against the Essendon midfielders. And in the end, I think they're just going to be too strong in the midfield core. Now, my brother has said that the Dogs have got too much depth, and English should absolutely monster Todd Goldstein around the ground, which I kind of agree with. I think Todd Goldstein was pretty decent against the Swans, but even then, Grundy probably had his best game of the year against them. So I think with the likes of English being able to run him off his feet, I think it would just be too strong. And the final game we're going to take a really deep dive into is Richmond v North Melbourne. Two cellar dwellers. Both teams, of course, lingering at the bottom of the ladder. North Melbourne were expected to jump up a little bit more this year. However, it really hasn't panned out at all. And even though Richmond have only really started their rebuild, you would say, they probably find themselves in a better spot than the Roos, all things considered. North Melbourne have been incredibly disappointing so far this year, and it's about time they start to beat up on these teams that are around them and jump up the ladder. On paper, they should be winning this game, the Roos. Their midfielders honestly compete with the majority of the competition, North Melbourne. We saw that against the Lions only a few days ago. They have one of the best key forwards in the game, and they have an all-Australian quality ruckman. Now, of course, their defence is incredibly shaky at best, but Richmond's forward line, you think they should be standing up pretty comfortably with them. However, all things saying that, I'm tipping Richmond. This year, they've been a lot more consistent. And despite some lapses in games we've seen, they've been a lot more trustworthy team, in my opinion, the Tigers. I think they can equalise in the midfield, and I think they can kick a winning score if they're able to find avenues to goal. Seth Campbell is arguably one of the best small forwards of the year so far, I think. I think he's been incredibly underrated. And plus, Bolt will be able to play this week. He's not under curfew, so he will be able to play on Nick Larkey, and I think that's a good matchup for them. Now, my brother has actually tipped the Roos. He's shown the faith to the blue and white. He has said that he's pretty confident that they will win. But he has also said that if the Roos do somehow lose this game into a 6-year rebuild, questions need to be asked of Alistair Clarkson, because if they lose next week, that is a deplorable, borderline embarrassing performance. And I mean, all things considered, I tend to agree with that. North Melbourne should be way further in front of Richmond. They should be probably around that mid-table mark, I would say, at this stage. They've got a decent list on paper, but they haven't been able to gel with it at all, and they just can't find a way to win. So I really don't know what North Melbourne will be able to contribute in this game. They should be beating the Tigers, but like I said, the Tigers have been a lot more trustworthy for me. That's why I'm going with the Tigers. That all being said, guys, let's get to our full tips for round 10. So my tips are the Gold Coast to beat the Hawks, the Blues to beat the Swans, Pies to beat the Crows, the Cats to beat Port Adelaide, the Giants to beat Fremantle, the Dogs to beat the Bombers, Richmond to beat North Melbourne, the Lions to beat Melbourne, and St Kilda to beat the West Coast Eagles. And my brother's tips for round 10 are the Gold Coast to beat Hawthorn, Carlton to beat Sydney, Collingwood to beat the Crows, Geelong to beat Port Adelaide, GWS to beat Fremantle, the Dogs to beat Essendon, North Melbourne to beat the Tigers, Brisbane to beat Melbourne, and St Kilda to beat the West Coast Eagles. So only one tip different this week. I'm going the Tigers, he's going North Melbourne. Now our certainty tips are, my brother is going with Geelong to beat Port Adelaide. Of course, Geelong losing to the Giants last week. And I'm going the Bulldogs over Essendon. Of course, the Dogs losing to the Gold Coast last week. But guys, that is all we have for the preview to round 10. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. If you did enjoy it, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. But that is all from me, guys. So we'll catch us all next time.